Let me set the stage. It's 9:04 a.m. on December 6th, 1917, and you're a firefighter in Halifax, Nova Scotia. It hasn't been a good morning here. Two freighters, one Swedish and the other French, collided in the middle of the harbor about a half hour ago, and now the French ship is slowly drifting towards Pier number 6 as it burns along its entire length. No one seems to know what she's carrying. The best guess among your crew is that it's some sort of gasoline or fuel oil. But whatever it was, it sent the crew to the lifeboats, paddling like madmen for the opposite side of the harbor. Something's not sitting right with you, though, as you sit on your engine waiting for the order to start pumping. This fire's been burning a lot hotter than any petroleum fire you've fought in your career, and even from hundreds of yards away, you can feel the radiant heat hitting your skin. You've also never seen one produce the yellow smoke coming out of the ship's forward hold. You're really hoping they get these lines set up soon before things get too far out of hand. You good? All the parts where they're supposed to be? Hold up a sec. You got a little blood on your face there. Let me just check. Okay, let's see here. Nothing to worry about. Just a couple of ruptured eardrums. You'll live. You're probably wondering just what happened and how we got here. Well, for starters, we just survived one of the largest man-made non-nuclear explosions in human history, if not the largest. As for the how, well, we're going to have to go back about a month and travel 600 miles south to Brooklyn, New York to find out. It's here on November 9th, 1917, that the SS Mont Blanc and her 39-year-old captain, Amélie Medic, are very carefully sailing into the Gravesend Bay. The Mont Blanc, owned by our old friends at CGT, is a 320-foot, 3,200-ton tramp freighter built in 1899 and well past her prime. Any other time, and she probably would have already been put out to pasture. These are desperate times, though. World War I is now entering its fourth year, and on the Eastern Front, Vladimir Lenin and the Bolsheviks have overthrown the Russian government and pulled Russia out of the war. Now Germany is massing troops on the Western Front, looking to deliver the knockout blow against Britain and France before American reinforcements can arrive and tip the scale. France needs every ship that meets its standards to carry supplies and material from America, and right now, those standards amount to not actively sinking at the moment. Medak had been in charge of the Mont Blanc for a month at this point, and as he pulled into the harbor, he had no idea what his cargo would even be. His first clue came when workers covered his cargo hold in a thick layer of tar, with wooden dividers fastened with copper nails installed to further divide the hull into smaller, hermetically sealed spaces. This worried the man, and his fears turned into outright terror when the French government agents finally handed him the manifest. Now, before I explain this devil's brew, let's take a few steps back. And maybe a few more steps back. You know what? Let's just move this conversation to Manhattan, just to be safe. Okay, now that we're far enough away from Lucifer's firecracker over there, I can talk about what she's carrying. Let's start with the stuff that's the least likely to explode. 250 tons of trinitrotoluene, better known as TNT. No, that's not a typo. Yes, I know it's one of the most famous explosives out there. But there's a reason it's still used today, and there's a reason why every nation in World War I was using it as explosive filler for their artillery shells. Sure, while the quality control at this time isn't up to today's standards, it was still far more resistant to shock and fire than other explosives at the time, such as dynamite and gun cotton. Speaking of gun cotton, the Mont Blanc's carrying 62 tons of that stuff in her cargo hold as well. Gun cotton's exactly what it sounds like. Pieces of cotton soaked in a mixture of sulfuric and nitric acids. It's a form of nitrocellulose, and back then, it was used to make smokeless propellants. It's got a flash point barely above freezing, an ignition temperature roughly where water boils, and it has to be transported in water to prevent it from spontaneously combusting. That's not the main hazard, though. The real threat is the 2,366 tons of trinitrophenol, better known as picric acid, that make up the vast majority of the Mont Blanc's cargo. It's roughly 1.5 times as powerful as TNT, and about as half as safe to handle as gun cotton. Even better, you can't let it touch metal because the resulting chemical reaction creates picric salts that are even more unstable and prone to blowing up than the acid itself. All three of these are Class 1 or explosive hazards according to the DOT, with TNT and picric acid firmly in the 1.1 or mass explosion hazard category. And because apparently this wasn't suicidally dangerous enough, French agents ordered nearly 500 barrels of a fuel oil known as benzol stacked 3 high on her deck after they learned she had little spare cargo tonnage left over. Now, had this been even a year earlier, the Mont Blanc would have quietly left port, spent 3 uneventful weeks at sea, going straight to Bordeaux, France, and promptly given the entire port a heart attack when they opened her cargo hold. That was before the Kaiser unleashed his U-boat fleet across the Atlantic, though, including American and Canadian waters. The Allies were losing tens of thousands of tons of shipping a month to submarines, and the only somewhat safe way across the Atlantic now was as part of a convoy. That's a problem for the Mont Blanc. Remember when I said that she was well past her prime? Well, that prime was about 11 knots on a good day with an empty cargo hold. Now, with tapped out engines and filled to the brim with high explosives, she was lucky to make 8 knots consistently. Far too slow for the high-speed convoys leaving New York. As such, on December 1st, she was ordered to Halifax, Nova Scotia, hoping to catch one of the slower convoys there. Now, I just want to note that there was an ensign used to designate explosives on board a vessel, but at the time, vessels were only required to fly it while loading and unloading the ship, with everything else being left up to the captain's discretion. Needless to say, Midik wasn't about to fly a giant sign saying, "Shoot me first," from a ship with U-boats lurking about, so she went without it for the voyage. Founded in 1749, Halifax, Nova Scotia had long served as the linchpin to British activities in North America. The city's geography not only created a natural harbor, but one that was easily defended. To sail from one end of the harbor to the other in Bedford Basin, ships had to cross a 5-mile stretch of water simply known as the Narrows. Flanked by the city of Halifax to the south and Dartmouth to the north, at its narrowest, the strait was less than a quarter mile across. Halifax had served as the Royal Navy's base of operations in the area during the 7 Years' War, the American Revolution, and the War of 1812, before falling into decline in the late 1800s as priorities shifted to elsewhere in the empire. This decline only reversed at the beginning of World War I, when the city became the main debarkation point for material and men traveling from Canada and America to the UK. By 1917, Halifax, Dartmouth, and the surrounding region had grown to 100,000 when you included all the sailors, soldiers, and merchants sailing into and out of the harbor, and the port was the busiest it had been in the last century. Unfortunately, the command staff weren't up to the challenge of handling the increased traffic. While technically under the jurisdiction of the fledgling Royal Canadian Navy, the less than 10-year-old organization had quickly found itself too undermanned and underfunded to handle the task of organizing convoys, leaving it to the Royal Navy. Canadian officers chafed under the condescending leadership of Royal Navy Reserve officers, who themselves lamented their exile to an unimportant backwater as the prospect of another major naval battle with Germany in the North Sea lingered on the horizon. Responsibilities between the two organizations were often muddled in exactly who was in charge of what. Adding to the chaos were the harbor pilots, the men responsible for getting ships into and out of the harbor. Not wanting to cut into their lucrative profits they were raking in, the pilots refused to expand their ranks or even fill vacant positions, leaving only 14 to 26 on duty. On top of that, these pilots, who on average had around 2 decades of experience, viewed out-of-town English and Canadian officers as nothing but disdain. They treated policies, procedures, and even basic maritime navigation rules as suggestions, with disastrous results on December 6th. By the time the Mont Blanc approached the mouth of Halifax Harbor on the evening of December 5th and embarked pilot Francis McKee, the anti-submarine nets had already been raised for the night. McKee retired to the captain's cabin with the Mont Blanc's officers, where he found out about the nature of the Mont Blanc's cargo. McKee was a bit dismayed that the Mont Blanc and her 3,000 tons of cargo were even being allowed into the harbor, since most ports in America and Europe had outright banned munition ships from staying in harbor if they weren't being loaded or unloaded. The Royal Navy Command hadn't sent any message to him or the Mont Blanc telling them otherwise, though, so he assumed that everything was in the clear. The truth was that because of the uncoordinated command structure, only a handful of officers in the RCN headquarters aboard the HMCS Niobe even knew the munition ship was parked outside their harbor entrance. Nor did they realize that a ship inside the harbor had overstayed its welcome. The SS IMO began life in 1899 as a Swedish livestock carrier before being converted into a processing ship for the nation's whaling fleet in 1912. When she had pulled into Halifax on December 3, 1917, she did so as a chartered vessel for the Belgian Relief Commission, transporting aid supplies from the U.S. to war-ravaged German-occupied Belgium. She was on a return trip to the States, and her empty cargo holds were causing her to ride high in the water, making her difficult to steer. Her Norwegian-born captain, Håkon From, had planned on leaving Halifax on the afternoon of the 5th, but a delay in the coal tender needed to refuel his ship for the journey to New York had left him on the wrong side of the submarine net when it had gone up. According to surviving crew members from the IMO, From was less than pleased by the development and made plans to leave Halifax as soon as the nets had come down on the 6th. The command staff aboard the Niobe didn't know this, though. In a perfect example of the jumbled command chain, the harbor pilots, the ship captains, and the RCN officers running the Halifax port inspections all assumed it was someone else's job to notify HQ when a ship was entering or exiting the harbor. As far as the commander knew, the IMO was scheduled to leave on the 5th, and so it had. So to recap the situation on the night of the 5th, we have a ship loaded with more explosives than God outside the harbor looking to get in at first light. Inside the harbor, we have a pissed-off captain of a 5,000-ton freighter looking to get out at first light. And between them, 100,000 people living in the maritime equivalent of a bike lane under the command of a willfully ill-informed command staff. This is gonna be fun. The crew of the Mont Blanc had awoken well before the sun came up on Halifax on December 6, 1917, making sure their journey into the harbor wouldn't be delayed even a second longer than it had to be. She received the signal to enter the harbor at 7:30 a.m. and raised the coded signal ensign to confirm her identity. One ensign she didn't raise, though, was the red hazard signal, a decision that would doom thousands of people as she entered the harbor at a steady 4 knots. At the same time, the IMO under the command of From and veteran pilot William Hayes was raising anchor to leave the harbor. Docked on the west side of the basin, she had to navigate several ships still in the harbor before entering the Narrows, and as such was closer to the Dartmouth side than the Halifax side. As soon as she was clear of the basin, From ordered her to 7 knots, over twice what the recommended speed for leaving the harbor was. About a mile ahead of the Mont Blanc was the American tramp steamer Clara, piloted by Edward Rayner. Now, basic maritime etiquette states that ships are supposed to stay on the right-hand side or starboard side of the road, just like driving a car. But by the time the Clara and the IMO had spied each other, the two had managed to swap lanes. From signaled his intent to pass on the port or left-hand side of the Clara, but Rayner's return signal indicated he intended to pass on the starboard or right-hand side. It was far easier for him to keep to the side he was on, Rayner later said. We were both on the wrong side. And here we have the latest in a chain of unforced human errors that have started back in New York and set this disaster in motion. From loading that much explosive into a single vessel, to the last-minute addition of the highly volatile benzol haphazardly lashed to the Mont Blanc's deck, to the lack of the warning ensign, to the chaos of the Halifax command structure and the pilot's cowboy attitudes towards rules. It can be argued that at this point, at roughly 8 a.m. or so, the fate of Halifax had already been sealed. As the Clara and the IMO passed each other, Rayner called out to Hayes to warn him that there is another vessel behind the Clara. Rayner was talking about the Mont Blanc, but unbeknownst to him, the tug Stella Maris had pulled out of her Halifax pier with 2 barges in between the freighters. The tug was attempting to get to the right side of the channel, like it was supposed to, when her captain saw the IMO bearing down on her in the wrong lane, going far faster than any ship normally dared go in the Narrows. The Stella Maris signaled its intention to pass to the port side, but the IMO replied with 2 whistles of its blowhorn, signaling its intention to pass to starboard, forcing the tug into abrupt course change. Meanwhile, at the other end of the channel, the Mont Blanc was doing everything right. She was proceeding down the starboard side of the channel, only a couple hundred feet off the shore from Dartmouth, traveling at a steady 4 knots. She had just passed the cruiser HMS Highflyer at 8:27 a.m. when McKee and Medic spotted the IMO ahead of them, about a mile off the Mont Blanc's bow. Now, it should be noted that the sun would have been rising almost directly behind the Mont Blanc, so there is a chance that From and Hayes couldn't see the French freighter, given how low she was in the water. That still doesn't excuse his actions, or what he's about to do next. Mont Blanc gave one long blast, not so subtly telling the IMO to get back into the correct lane so they could pass each other on the port side. Because of the events that are about to happen, we'll never know what exactly was going on in the IMO's bridge. But what we do know is that the IMO gave 2 short whistles to indicate its intent to pass the Mont Blanc on the right. 2 ships were about a half a mile apart from each other now and closing at 10 knots, or 11.5 miles an hour. The Mont Blanc once again gave a signal blast to the air horn as her engines were thrown into a dead stop, telling the IMO to change course. And once again, the IMO gave 2 blasts of its air horn, telling the Mont Blanc that it had no intention of doing so. The 2 ships were locked in a game of chicken, and unfortunately, both captains blinked at the same time. With the 2 ships 150 feet apart, Medic ordered a hard turn to port. At the same time, the IMO threw her engines into reverse, causing her bow to swing to starboard as she slowed down. Had only one of these things occurred, the two ships would have passed each other with feet to spare, the only harm being an exchange of French and Norwegian curses as the two captains yelled at each other. Instead, the IMO's bow continued to track the Mont Blanc as she raced across the other side of the channel to escape. It's now 8:46 a.m., and the only sound to be heard in Halifax is the screech of metal on metal. The IMO's bow tears into the number 1 cargo hold of the Mont Blanc, where the picric acid is being stored, opening up a 5-foot hole in her hull from her deck to her waterline. Thankfully, both ships had slowed enough that the shock of the collision didn't cause the picric acid to detonate immediately and blow both ships sky high. Unfortunately, the collision knocked over a dozen oil drums of the benzo, causing them to burst open and spill the highly flammable fuel all over the forward deck. As the IMO's engines pulled her back from the Mont Blanc, her hull plane sent a shower of sparks along the French vessel's deck, igniting the spilled benzo. Flames raced across the foredeck and into the cargo hold within minutes, cutting off the crew from the only firefighting equipment aboard the Mont Blanc, located in the extreme bow of the ship. Medic briefly considered scuttling the ship to keep her from exploding, but the process would have taken half an hour just to open the valves, another 2 hours to flood the cargo hold. Time the captain knew he didn't have. He knew he had minutes at most before something in the hold reached its ignition point and the entire 3,000 tons of explosives sent him, his crew, and the entire ship into lunar orbit. A lot has been made of the decision by the crew of the Mont Blanc to abandon their vessel immediately. In the coming months, questions would be raised about their courage, and charges of negligence would be thrown at several members. Could they have done anything, even pointing the ship out to sea where there was a chance the explosion would have happened farther away from Halifax? Maybe they could have. Both Medic and McKee considered the option as they were waiting with the rest of the crew to board the lifeboats. Just throw her into a hard turn until she was headed back out the way she came, crank the engines wide open, and run her out to sea. With a little luck, they'd even manage to flood the cargo hold and put the fire out before it cooked off the explosives inside. In the end, though, they both knew they didn't have the time to pull that off. And given we're less than 15 minutes from the explosion, I have a hard time imagining their efforts to send the Mont Blanc out of the harbor would have done anything but move this epicenter of the blast a few hundred yards to the southeast. Medic, McKee, and the crew of the Mont Blanc paddled for Dartmouth on the west bank of the channel, screaming at every passing vessel to warn them of the explosion they expected to happen any second now. Unfortunately, only McKee spoke English well enough to be understood, and the warnings fell on deaf ears as they were drowned out by the noise of the harbor. The crew didn't even bother tying off the lifeboats as they reached the shoreline near Dartmouth, running deep into the woods as they waited for the explosion they knew was coming. It's now 8:52 a.m., and the Mont Blanc is slowly drifting towards the Richmond neighborhood of Halifax, gently running ashore at Pier 6 as if she still had a crew. Crews from nearby vessels sprang into action immediately to try and contain the blaze. Unfortunately, without the red hazard flag flying from her mast to tell them otherwise, they all assumed that the Mont Blanc was an oil tanker, not the largest bomb in the world at the moment. For comparison, here's the Department of Transportation Emergency Response Guidebook recommendation for fighting a fire involving flammable liquids. And here's the guidelines for fighting a fire involving Class 1.1 explosives. Notice a difference yet? Specifically in the part about what to do if the containers are involved? I cannot stress this enough. You do not fight a fire involving this much explosives. You calmly and orderly get all your equipment, personnel, and squishy civilians the next town over as fast as possible, then use that manpower and equipment you just saved to fight all the secondary fires that will be springing up after it goes kaboom. The Stella Maris was the first to arrive on scene, having dropped her barges off at a nearby pier as soon as the crew witnessed the collision. The tug and her fire hose arrived at Pier 6 at 8:53 a.m., only a minute after the Mont Blanc had made landfall. Her crew was joined by officers from both High Flyer and the Niobe at 8:55, who quickly decided to have the Maris tow the Mont Blanc over to an isolated stretch of Dartmouth side of the channel, where she could burn herself out in peace. By 8:58 a.m., the fire on the Mont Blanc had spread across her entire length. The creosote-soaked wood planks of Pier Number 6 were beginning to ignite from the radiant heat of the benzo fueled fire. For most people watching the blaze, the fear was that the fire would soon be running through the entire city, which was largely made of wood. Only a handful of officers in Halifax knew about the Mont Blanc's cargo. One of them, Lieutenant Commander James Murray, happened to be out on the water that morning. As soon as he spotted the Mont Blanc burning, he ordered his ship straight to the nearest pier and raced ashore to alert the harbor commander. At the same time, he sent a sailor to the dispatch office of the nearby Richmond Railway Terminal, where clerk William Levitt and dispatcher Vincent Coleman were on duty. Both were advised to evacuate, but just as he was walking out the door, Coleman realized a passenger train carrying 300 people was set to arrive in the station, which was only 200 yards from the burning freighter. Returning to his post, Coleman sent off one last message to the next station up the line. Hold the train. Ammunition ship afire in the harbor, making for Pier 6 and will explode. Guess this will be my last message. Goodbye, boys. Within a half hour of that message going out, Coleman, Lovett, and Murray would all be dead, along with hundreds of Halifax citizens. Barrels of benzol began exploding with increasing regularity as the clock struck 9 a.m., creating a spectacular sight that drew workers and passing civilians to whatever vantage point they could to get a better view. Thousands of faces pressed against the pane glass windows to see what was happening in the harbor, a decision many would soon regret. Over by the Richmond rail yard, hundreds gathered on a pedestrian bridge straddling the tracks. It was about this time that someone finally notified the Halifax Fire Department by pulling Firebox 83. The department at this point consisted of 36 paid firefighters and 86 volunteers spread across 8 stations and 14 apparatus, only one of which was motorized. It was this engine, a 1913 American LaFrance pumper that the men of West Street Station 2 had lovingly named Patricia, that was the first piece of apparatus on scene. On board was driver William Billy Wells, captains William Broderick and Michael Maltus, firefighters Walter Hennessy, Frank Killian, and Frank Leahy. Right behind them were Fire Chief Edward P. Condon and Deputy Chief William P. Blunt driving the 1911 McClellan Roadster the department used as its chief's car. Firefighters recoiled from the intense heat emanating from the Mont Blanc as it burned along its entire length, and Chief Gordon hit Box 83 again to signal more units to respond. The men aboard Patricia set about unrolling and connecting their hoses, expecting a long day of fighting this fire. They never complete their work, though, because it's now 9:04:35 a.m., the moment Halifax got its first taste of industrial warfare. We'll never know exactly which part of the Mont Blanc's cargo detonated first, short of being in the cargo hold the second it went off. But eyewitness reports seem to point to picric acid as the culprit. Regardless, that first detonation created a chain reaction that lasted only 1/15 of a second. In the time it takes you and me to blink, the Mont Blanc pulled the deadliest disappearing act in human history. To give you an idea on how big of an explosion this was, here's something at a slightly smaller scale. This is Beirut, Lebanon, on October 4th, 2020. And that was 2,750 tons of ammonium nitrate fertilizer, detonating with the explosive equivalent of 1.1 kilotons of TNT. Once you do all the fancy conversion math, the Mont Blanc's cargo of picric acid, gun cotton, and TNT came out to 3 kilotons. In an instant, the temperature near the Mont Blanc soared to 9,000 degrees Fahrenheit, just shy of the surface temperature of the sun. The ship, Pier 6, and everyone on it was disintegrated. Pressure wave from the blast ripped through the harbor, pushing an ever-growing pile of debris along with it as entire streets ripped clean off their foundations and shattered into kindling, killing most of those inside instantly. Windows were shattered by the blast as far as 50 miles away in Truro, Nova Scotia, as a 2-mile-tall mushroom cloud formed over Halifax. Immediately after this, a 30-foot-tall tsunami surged into the city as water in the channel rushed to fill the 300-meter hole punched into it by the blast. Many lucky enough to have miraculously survived the initial explosion found themselves being sucked into the harbor by the tide. The lengths ran the length of the Channel and Bedford Basin, devastating Dartmouth and areas all along the coast. Chief Condon and Deputy Chief Blunt were both killed instantly when their vehicle was picked up by the blast wave and thrown inland like a toy. The same thing happened to Patricia, who had been stripped down to her chassis by the blast. Much like their chiefs, both captains were killed instantly, along with firefighters Hennessy and Killian. Firefighter Leahy survived the explosion, only to succumb to his injuries and infection a few weeks later on December 31st. In addition, 2 other firefighters, John Spruan and John Dugan, were killed when their apparatus was caught in the debris field en route to the pier. Of the 8 Halifax firefighters who had arrived on Pier 6, only driver Billy Wells would walk away from the explosion and live to see 1918. His survival was still a bit of a mystery even to Billy himself. By his own account, one second Billy had been sitting on his engine, waiting for the signal to start pumping, and the next he was standing in the road a couple hundred yards down the street, stripped naked by the blast, with a lacerated right arm, steering wheel still in his hands. As Wells and the other survivors came to grips with what had just happened, they found a scene not too far off of that of Verdun or Flanders. The land had been wiped clean of almost all traces of humanity for 300 meters of what had once been Pier 6. And most buildings within 600 meters were little more than piles of rubble, sometimes piled 3 to 4 buildings deep.
Survivors who had been out of their houses at the time of the explosion struggled to find the streets they had lived on, never mind their houses. To the north, the Richmond Railway Yard had been flattened by the blast, killing Coleman and Levitt instantly. The pedestrian bridge over it, where all those onlookers had gathered, had ceased to exist. The walls of the nearby North Street station had survived, but the same could not be said for the roof, and the resulting collapse killed 60 people. To the south, the once towering Arcadia sugar refinery at the base of Pier 8 had been flattened in an instant, killing its entire workforce. The walls of the refinery fell on an orphanage next door, crushing the matron and 27 children who had been hiding in the basement. Similar fates befell the Rome Street School, Hills and Sons Refinery, and just about every church in the district. Further south, flaming debris tore through the Naval Yard and Wellington Barracks. Just about every window in the city had popped like a balloon from the pressure wave, and many residents, having pressed their faces against the glass for a better look as their curiosity got the better of them, suffered horrific face and eye injuries from flying glass. Things were much better for those out on the water. The Stella Maris had been picked up by the blast and slammed back down to once been Pier 6, killing her captain and 19 of her 24-man crew. Of the dozen men from the Niobe and High Flyer who had been sent to assist them in fighting the fire on the Mont Blanc, only one survived, and both cruisers were riddled with shrapnel from the blast, killing 16 aboard the Niobe and 6 on the High Flyer. Across the harbor on Dartmouth shore lay the crippled Imo, having been run aground by the tsunami. The blast had nearly sheared the superstructure off her hull, killing Fromm, Hayes, and First Officer Iverson, along with 5 members of her crew. Nearly 24 other merchant ships were damaged in the blast. In an instant, nearly 1,500 people had been killed, 10,000 injured, and close to 25,000 rendered homeless. Survivors clawed their way out of the wreckage onto the streets littered with dead bodies as pitch-black rain of benzol that had been launched into the atmosphere fell back to the earth. All lines of communication and transportation into and out of Halifax's north end had been severed by the blast, and soon rumors of German attacks, including one of a naval squadron shelling the city, filled the air. To make matters worse, almost all of the senior leadership of not only the city's emergency services, but the military as well, had been killed or wounded in the blast. For the next few hours at least, the Richmond district of Halifax would be on its own. Initial rescue efforts were haphazard and disorganized, headed by small bands of firefighters, police officers, sailors, and soldiers who began combing the wreckage. In many places, the only efforts came from the residents themselves, using nothing but their bare hands to dig out their families and neighbors. These rescue efforts were further hampered when reports surfaced that the Wellington Barracks had a magazine fire and was about to blow sky high as well. The truth was that ashes from an overturned stove in the barracks furnace room had started a small fire near the magazine before being quickly extinguished by a lieutenant named C.A. McClellan, but that didn't stop onlookers from fearing the worst when they watched smoke begin to rise from the barracks. Refugees headed to the open spaces of Halifax's public parks as soldiers dumped the contents of the magazine into the harbor. Volunteers from the Red Cross and St. John Ambulance Brigade filtered among these groups as they huddled in the rain for over an hour. Still, the handful of volunteers in both organizations were swiftly overrun by the thousands of refugees. Similar scenes played out in the hospitals all over the city, all of which had been damaged by the blast. Altogether, there were around 900 hospital beds, a number you could push to a little under 1,100 by opening up the military hospitals to civilians. This only amounted to a tenth of the needed hospital beds, and wounded soon clogged the emergency rooms, hallways, and even the outdoor spaces around the hospitals like Camp Hill. Doctors and nurses, all dealing with fears about their own families, and more than a few injured themselves, made their way to the nearest hospital or took medical equipment from their private practices to those too injured to make it there. These life-saving surgeries, performed in bombed-out ERs, drugstore counters, and even in the middle of the street with little anesthesia and next to no supplies, proved to be the difference in survival for hundreds of Halifax residents. It wasn't until noon that a triumvirate of Deputy Mayor Henry Caldwell, Police Chief Frank Hanrahan, and Army Colonel W.E. Thompson began bringing order to the chaos. Despite having no emergency response plan to speak of, the 3 men quickly took advantage of Halifax's wartime mobilization to get aid where and when it was needed. Soldiers took to the streets to help with rescue efforts, clear roads, and deter looters. The few surviving automobiles were drafted into service to carry wounded and supplies. Grocery store owners began organizing food banks for the tens of thousands of homeless, and the Army began setting up a tent city in the North Commons for those without shelter. The collection and identification of the dead began in earnest that afternoon, a task that Halifax ironically had a system already in place for thanks to the sink of the Titanic 5 years earlier. As the closest major port to the disaster, Halifax had been the collection point for more than 1,500 bodies plucked from the icy waters of the North Atlantic. Now, 5 years later, Arthur Barnstead dusted off the same system his father John Henry had used back then to keep track of the hundreds of dead arriving at the makeshift morgue set up at the Chibukto Road School. The system worked so well that, on the night of the 6th, the morgue was already allowing families inside to identify loved ones. It wasn't much, but the city was taking its first few shaky steps towards recovery, just in time for Mother Nature to step in. As the Mont Blanc had been laying waste to Halifax, a storm system was working its way up the east coast of the United States. That storm system hit the city on the morning of December 7th, dumping over a foot of snow as 45-mile-per-hour wind gusts clawed at the ruins of Halifax's north end. Well, this storm put an end to the fires that threatened to engulf the city, like San Francisco in the wake of the 1906 earthquake. It also collapsed structures that had been hanging on by a thread over the heads of their residents. Others simply froze to death in the cold December night. Roads that had just been cleared became quagmires that even horse-drawn carts struggled to traverse, and miles of telegraph line hastily thrown up during the afternoon were knocked over again, plunging the city back into a communication blackout. Out in the harbor, damaged ships were torn from their moorings and sent adrift, forcing rescue crews to abandon search efforts in order to secure them again. As the city began digging itself out once again, its leaders realized that outside help would be needed. Fortunately, that help was already on its way. Pullman's telegram at 8:49 a.m. hadn't reached St. John's in time to stop the passenger train from leaving its station, but it had provided the first warning of the disaster to the outside world. When no further communications from his office reached them, the telegram operators quickly put together two and two and sent messages further down the line. By 10:30 a.m., only an hour and a half after the explosion, cities as far away as Toronto, Boston, and New York already had a rough idea of what had happened. That passenger train itself would become one of the first pieces of outside assistance, out of happenstance and proximity, much like the rest of the rescue efforts that morning. As the train pulled into Rockingham, a Halifax suburb just north of Richmond, it was greeted by destroyed tracks and a flood of refugees. The conductor offloaded his passengers, except for one man, a doctor named Avery DeWitt, and turned the train around for a return trip to Truro, Nova Scotia. DeWitt spent the entire journey back in a train car performing surgeries, assisted by his father and sister who had jumped aboard at Wolfsville. The three medical professionals were later credited with saving hundreds of lives. More trains arrived from Truro and other parts of Nova Scotia that afternoon, bringing in doctors and medical supplies and taking wounded to the hospitals with them. These medical professionals, including those from a nearby medical university, were pressed into service alongside their Halifax peers. One eye doctor named George Cox later reported performing 592 eye operations, including 249 removals. These doctors and nurses worked from anywhere between 48 and 72 hours straight, and in at least one case were driven to suicide by the horrors they had witnessed. Even with relief forces from Truro and the neighboring towns, supplies began to run low by that evening. Surgeons later reported that the tools had been dulled to the point of uselessness by the workload. Makeshift hospitals were set up at City Hall, the YMCA, and a dry dock steamship known as the SS Old Colony, but those were quickly overwhelmed by the sheer number of wounded. In the afternoon, officers from the troop ship USS Van Steuben, which had been damaged by the blast, and the tug USS Tacoma, which had witnessed the blast 50 miles out to sea and immediately diverted to Halifax, arrived at Thompson's command center to offer anything they could to help. Within the hour, hundreds of sailors were ashore working to clear the streets and recover the dead. All across eastern Canada and the northeast United States, cities like Boston, Massachusetts began organizing relief forces. Boston, in many ways, was the exact opposite of Halifax, a city still in the midst of mobilizing for war, but prepared for disaster thanks to a forward-thinking committee of public safety created by Governor Samuel McCall. As soon as the first telegraph message had arrived, McCall and his committee began organizing a relief force consisting of 4 train cars filled with 13 doctors, 10 nurses, 6 Red Cross advisors, 4 railway supervisors, 5 reporters, and as many medical supplies as they could carry. Without any news from Halifax, a few members expressed concerns that they may have been overdoing the aid as the train left the station at 10 p.m. that night, less than 12 hours after news of the explosion first reached Boston. It wouldn't be until the first reports from those journalists trickled back a day later that they would realize how severe the situation was. Leading this effort was a hard-charging Jewish American by the name of Abraham Captain Rachesky. Rachesky, known as Cap on account of his middle name, quickly realized the extent of the damage as he talked to relief workers boarding the train in St. John's the next morning and fired off a series of telegrams asking for building and medical supplies as soon as possible. Much like in the city, the blizzard on the 7th grounded this rescue effort to a halt just outside of Halifax. Passengers and crew members shoveled through 6-foot-high snowdrifts to clear the tracks for the relief train, led by Cap himself. The Americans immediately went to work when the train pulled into Halifax on Saturday, December 8th, meeting with Cowell and the Canadian Prime Minister Robert Borden to see where they were needed most. The doctors quickly set up a temporary hospital inside the Bellevue Gentlemen's Club and began taking patients by 2:30 that afternoon. While the impact of these doctors and the waves that arrived after them in the coming weeks is massively overblown by American newspapers, They did provide Halifax doctors who had been performing the truly life-saving work over the last 2 days a chance to finally rest and regroup. What can't be overstated is the material support Boston gave, totaling close to $15 million in today's money, and including enough supplies to fill 2 5,000-ton transport ships along with another dozen trains. Enough building supplies were provided to not only complete a small town's worth of 2-story temporary apartment buildings, but to also rebuild the city twice over. Boston gave so much, in fact, that Halifax's mayor had to request a hold on all aid until they could figure out just how to rebuild the Richmond district. As 1917 turned into 1918, Halifax began clawing its way back to normalcy. Convoy operations into and out of the port restarted on December 11th, and the port itself was fully operational by Christmas. Clearing the wreckage from the surrounding neighborhoods would take until late spring, and bodies from the explosion would still be uncovered as late as the summer of 1919, bringing the final death toll to 1,951. Architects Thomas Adams and George Ross were brought in to rebuild the Richmond district. Faced with the shortage of lumber due to the ongoing war effort and a general distrust of wood construction the explosion had created among the population, the two men settled for a type of granite concrete known as hydrostone as their construction material of choice, giving the district the name it still holds to this day. The district had been rebuilt by the end of 1919, but it never returned to the working-class industrial powerhouse it had been prior to the disaster. Though the city had healed physically, the emotional and psychological scars lingered well into the 20th century. The Halifax Relief Commission, set up by Lieutenant Governor McCallum Grant to help with funeral costs, medical bills, and disability pensions, would continue to pay out benefits until 1976. The Canadian National Institute for the Blind, created in part due to the sheer number of eye injuries caused by the blast, is still an internationally recognized institution that exists to this day. As word got out about what had really happened, the fury of the general public quickly settled on Captain Middick, Pilot McKee, and the crew of the Mont Blanc who had survived the explosion unharmed outside of the loss of a single man. By the time the Wreck Commission started in January of 1918, just about everybody wanted their heads on a pike. Now, I know what you're thinking. I spent a pretty good amount of time explaining how the IMO was in the wrong for pretty much the entire journey through the harbor, and the most you could hang the Mont Blanc's crew on was the failure to adequately warn nearby vessels of its hazardous cargo. What you're not accounting for is that the war had inflamed tensions between the English-speaking Canadians and the French-Canadian Quebecois to a level not seen since the 7 Years' War of 1757. In the mind of Judge Arthur Drysdale, the press, and the general public, the disaster had to be the act of deliberate harm by the French captain of a French vessel. Now, if this makes no sense to you, don't worry about following their logic. I think I managed to, and in the process I'm pretty sure I set an Olympic record for mental gymnastics. The important part is that it let the lawyer of the IMO's ownership get away with absolutely everything short of murder in the courtroom during the inquiry. He led, bullied, intimidated, and even lied to witnesses to paint the captain and McKee as incompetent hooligans joyriding a floating bomb through Halifax. To add to this, he had the full support of a judge who had told both lawyers that he had already made up his mind well before the inquiry started. Not only was the Mont Blanc found solely responsible for the accident, but Drysdale also recommended McKee and Middick both be tried for manslaughter and have their licenses revoked. Middick was quietly escorted back to France, where he lived out the rest of his days as a captain until his death in 1955. McKee, on the other hand, was left to bear the full brunt of the public scrutiny. Despite the Canadian Supreme Court overturning Drysdale's inquiry and finding both vessels equally at fault, McKee still spent a decade recovering his license and died in 1961 with his reputation still tarnished by the disaster, becoming its final casualty. The IMO was refloated in April of 1918 and renamed the Governor. She ran aground on the Falklands on November 30th, 1921, after her helmsman got drunk at the wheel and fell asleep. Her wreck still sits there to this day. Coleman would become a national hero in the eyes of the Canadian public for his actions that morning. In 2012, the CBC featured him in its Heritage Minutes series, which became its most viewed episode. A ship manufacturing facility owned by the Irving Oil Company now sits where Pier 6 once stood. Half a mile away at the top of Fort Neelum Hill sits a memorial bell tower overlooking the area of destruction by the blast. Every year, the city of Halifax sends a Christmas tree to Boston, Massachusetts, in thanks for the assistance the city provided on that day in 1917 when Armageddon touched its shore.